When it comes to human evolution, there are some who say that the out of Africa theory is a conspiracy theory. They say it's all a lie, it's all fake. Homo sapiens are, without a doubt, the planet's last living hominins. Nevertheless, we can forget the straightforward theory of human evolution from within Africa. In fact, the history of our ancestry has been completely rewritten in light of a vast array of fossils and genome research. Remarkable new scientific research, discoveries, and analyses have completely upended everything. One argument that has been raging for many years in the field of paleoanthropology is the question of the evolutionary ancestry of the modern human family. A new theory of human evolution proposes that rather than one ancestral group, Homo sapiens descended from numerous genetically diverse populations dispersed throughout Africa. According to the most prominent theory, Homo sapiens evolved in eastern Africa about 150,000 years ago, developing modern behavior about 60,000 years ago, and then sweeping out of Africa to colonize the world, completely replacing any prehistoric humans encountered. This is the story of our modern human manifest destiny, our human origins as we once understood it. The out of Africa paradigm has become so entrenched that it's simple to forget how new it is. However, the neat story is being shattered by new fossils, ancient tools, and analyses of ancient and modern genomes. The only question now is how many, if any, of our prior presumptions still hold true, as the dust is still settling. It has become just as controversial to challenge the long-held belief as it was to challenge the Clovis first theory of American colonization. Chris Stringer and Peter Andrews of the British Museum created the out of Africa theory in the late 1980s. Ironically, the phrase out of Africa was coined after the 1985 movie of the same name, about Europeans escaping post-colonial Africa. In fact, the out of Africa hypothesis was invented in the 1980s after anthropologists had been kicked out of Africa when it became known that some of them had been working as spies. It was even reported that some CIA men had posed as anthropologists in Africa. Anthropologists working as agents for the CIA was an issue that had been known publicly since the 1960s, and was a real problem for the anthropological community in the United States and Britain. In the 1980s, African governments were asserting their independence, and began weeding out secret agents and racist anthropologists. Therefore, in order to be able to work in Africa, anthropologists and archaeologists must be strict adherents to the out of Africa hypothesis. Way back in 1987, a shocking revelation. 147 mitochondrial genomes from people living all over the world were sequenced by a team of geneticists from the University of California. According to the research, everyone is descended from a single woman known as mitochondrial Eve, who lived in Africa about 200,000 years ago. Mitochondria are only passed down through mothers in cells to their offspring. The molecular out of Africa hypothesis has been accepted by population geneticists for about 25 to 30 years, despite early concern with it among phylogeneticists with experience beyond that of genus Homo. The problem with this theory was that it was predicated on false premises. Although the mathematical presumptions used in the molecular clock have been shown to be incorrect, and this was one of the first genetic studies ever conducted, more than 35 years ago, and we are still told that this proves the out of Africa theory. In spite of the lack of paleontological evidence at the time, and the fact that reanalysis of the data did not favor the phylogenies that served as the foundation for the out of Africa hypothesis, the two molecular studies that came from the same laboratory were extremely important in the promotion of the out of Africa hypothesis 35 years ago. Nevertheless, the study had a huge impact. The recent out of Africa package, which asserts that modern humans suddenly appeared in eastern or southern Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago, and then quickly spread across the globe, was quickly formed from this information. Additionally, the package made a distinction between behavioral and anatomical modernity. Early Homo sapiens, according to archaeological evidence, had bodies similar to ours but were less mentally developed. The entire package did not evolve until much later, perhaps as a result of a chance mutation, allowing for dispersal outside of Africa, around 50,000 or 60,000 years ago. This interesting, captivating tale became known as the human revolution. The fossil evidence initially supported this theory, though this could have been due to the streetlight effect. This phenomenon is caused when scientists look for information only where it is easiest to find, and ignore the much difficult areas. There were a few older human skulls that appeared to support the theory, even though there were no remains from the crucial time of human evolution, around 150,000 years ago. One of the most distinctive features of modern humans is the shape of our skulls. In contrast to our extinct ancestors, we have small, flat, delicate faces, prominent chins, and spherical brain cases. A skull is regarded as belonging to our species if it possesses all or the majority of these traits. When 3 human skulls, 2 adult and 1 juvenile, were found in Ethiopia's Afar Depression in 1997, things only got better. Between 154,000 and 160,000 years old, Homo hominins have a blend of ancient and contemporary facial and cranial features. They were found using tools that combined features of both ancient and modern Stone Age technology. Given their age, location, and toolkit, the researchers were certain that the hominins were the probable immediate ancestors of anatomically modern humans, because they neatly fit the recently proposed out-of-Africa model. You might believe that it is an open and shut case, but that ended up being the pinnacle. Since then, it has become challenging, if not impossible, to fit new discoveries into this tidy little box. The conclusion that these fossils represent the main lineage giving rise to modern humans, and that Homo sapiens dispersed and evolved throughout Africa would have been supported by genomic research. The lack of genetic evidence from these fossils and the hazy boundaries between different species within the genus Homo have led some to question the designation of these fossils as Homo sapiens. At Omo Kaibish in southern Ethiopia, Richard Leakey and his team discovered 2 of the oldest known complete skulls with hints of this anatomy in 1967. The skulls are about 200,000 years old and go by the names Omo 1 and Omo 2. They blend ancient and contemporary features, which is precisely what you would anticipate of an ancient African human, living before the development of anatomical modernity. Similar tales were told by a number of other specimens from eastern and southern Africa. In fact, these fossils' exact classification is still up for debate because of their fragmentary nature. These composite humans' diverse anatomies have unavoidably sparked arguments over which individuals belong to our species, and which do not. Many anthropologists agree that certain fossils belong to Homo sapiens, but there is never a complete consensus. Most notably, Omo 1 and the Homo hominins, though they differ greatly, and some consider the latter to be a subspecies, are the closest relatives of Homo sapiens. However, contrary to what we are led to believe, cranial reconstructions and interpretations are not always straightforward. The entire face of the Omo 1 skull, with the exception of a few small bones, is missing, as you can see from the reconstruction when compared to the actual bones. Chris Stringer of the British Museum, who essentially created the Out of Africa concept, collaborated on this reconstruction with his mentor Bruce Andrews, who had previously worked for and been supported by the renowned Louis Leakey. While some paleoanthropologists are pleased to include the fossils from Omo Kaibish in the modern family, others are not. Typically, the rejected items are labeled as African archaics, which essentially sidesteps the problem. Some of them might belong to different species. For instance, it has been suggested that the Florisbad fossils be categorized as Homo helmi. However, as we shall see, recent discoveries seem to be undermining this notion. Because it is based on an increasingly out-of-date definition of what constitutes a species, classifying humanity might all be for naught. A species is frequently believed to be a collection of organisms that breed together. The phrase biological species is only one of many opposing definitions, though. Other classifications are based on shared behavior, genes, or anatomical features, and some are based on shared ancestors. The Jebel Irhoud skull from Morocco is another that is frequently referred to as an early Homo sapiens. The skull is the earliest specimen of so-called early Homo sapiens ever discovered, having been dated to about 330,000 years ago. But what specifically makes this skull a Homo sapien? Well, that's because, in comparison to other skulls from that era, the brow ridge and the face are more modern-looking. Nevertheless, it is most closely related to Neanderthals when you compare the entire skull, including the brain case and the jaw. The fact that this skull is a chimera, meaning that it was made from bone fragments from several different skulls, is another issue. As a result, it only represents a population and not a real human. Despite the fact that you may believe this classification to be a foregone conclusion, this is highly dubious, and many prominent anthropologists are skeptical of this interpretation. The Florisbad skull from South Africa, which dates to roughly 250,000 years ago, is the third African skull that is thought to be an early Homo sapiens. But once again, there are problems with this skull. One problem with this skull is that it is also incredibly incomplete, with only the face and top of the skull having been discovered, but no full brain case or jaw. Some well-known researchers dispute the age of 250,000 years, and think the skull is much younger, indicating that it is not actually an early Homo sapiens, but rather a modern human. If you're looking for a broad framework to examine how modern humans evolved, consider the time between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago. There are indications that there were populations of archaic humans all over the African continent at the beginning of this period, possibly even in Greater Africa, which includes parts of the Middle East. These were frequently geographically or ecologically isolated from one another by deserts or jungles, and they evolved primarily independently, with sporadic contact and interbreeding, possibly when climatic conditions changed and boundaries shifted. The now famous mosaic skulls were left as a result of this ephemeral situation, which lasted for at least 150,000 years. New stones and bones are revealing a fresh and more widely accepted theory of where humans came from. The current model is not completely upended by this African multi-regionalism. The idea of a recent, localized origin within a distinct population has been replaced with a much deeper origin story that dates back at least 300,000 and possibly up to 500,000 years. The continent is still the cradle of humanity, even though saying humans evolved in Africa doesn't mean very much because it's a vast area. The African multi-regionalism model has shifted attention to a different and, arguably, more intriguing ancestor question, even as identifying our direct ancestor grows more challenging. Which of these groups of more or less modern humans, as the new hypothesis suggests, gave rise to the modern human population? The African Middle Stone Age was teeming with semi-independently evolving groups, according to the new hypothesis. When it comes to the transition to modern humans, this is the divergence that we should really be thinking about. Regrettably, the fossil record in of this time period Africa is very sparse. In fact, the trail gets quite cold at this point. Although there are some bones, they are dispersed and challenging to incorporate into a bigger picture. Even the genetics are unclear, despite what you are told. The most recent studies suggest that between 260,000 and 350,000 years ago, modern humans began to evolve. This date range is not a margin of error, rather, it depicts a protracted process of patchwork evolution throughout sizable portions of Africa. For example, scientists have created a virtual last common ancestor of all currently living humans, so there may be another angle to the story. By mapping the morphological diversity of ancient and modern human skulls, including Neanderthals but excluding archaic Africans, they calculated what the skull of a presumed last common ancestor looked like in the early Middle Stone Age. The top 5 most complete skulls from the era were then compared to their virtual counterpart. The South African Florisbad skull, 2 East African specimens from Elia Springs and Omo II, and finally the Litoli skull all shared characteristics with the virtual ancestor. The most resemblance to Neanderthals was found in the North African skull from Jebel Irhoud. This suggests that we are not related to our northern relatives, but rather to ancient Africans from southern and eastern Africa. Or, to put it another way, the tangled stream, though with many side branches, eventually coalesced into a main channel. However, when the secrets of a pair of skulls found in Greece in 1978 were finally revealed, it was a real shocker. They were found side by side in a block of volcanic breccia in the Apodyma coastal cave. Before a reanalysis, both were believed to be 150,000 years old, and to have come from Neanderthals. One of them came from a Neanderthal that lived 170,000 years ago. The other, however, was 210,000 years old, and descended from Homo sapiens. It had a mix of contemporary and prehistoric features. Over time, the skulls became mixed together after finding themselves in the same spot in the cave. The only conclusion is that after a millennia-long journey by foot, or possibly raft, around the eastern Mediterranean, modernish humans who originated in Africa more than 200,000 years ago successfully dispersed into southern Europe. It's very unexpected, and it is considered a failed exodus from Africa. But can we really say for certain that this was a failed exodus, when we find so many skulls with Homo sapiens traits throughout the Levant and Greece? The current consensus holds that modern humans migrated out of Africa in large numbers after 100,000 years ago, most likely via the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, or both, and gradually made their way into Europe and along Eurasia's southern coast, most likely in search of high-quality food resources, before backfilling into Central Asia from what is now China. These new early dispersal discoveries are intriguing, but the overall theory remains largely unchallenged. Nonetheless, the paleontological support for the out-of-Africa hypothesis is debatable, a situation that has become more apparent in light of growing Eurasian paleontological knowledge over the past few decades. The characterization of the African fossils has a noticeably wide range, ranging from the fossil evidence for an African origin for modern humans is robust, to the hominin fossil record of the African Middle Pleistocene is extremely sparse. Compared to Eurasia, Africa has significantly less information about the origin and evolution of Homo sapiens. Within the Homo sapiens lineage itself, the basal divergence between pygmy, Bushman and other recent lineages is estimated to have occurred around 250,000 years ago. The two Yoruba exoduses into Africa are estimated to have occurred at 225,000 and 180,000 years ago, respectively. According to analyses of Antarctic ice core records, the ages of three of these estimates, 250,000, 225,000, and 125,000 years before the present, coincide with warm global temperatures that were preceded by low maxima. Although the timings of the molecular estimates and climatic changes may not be exactly coincidental, they highlight the scenario of oscillating climatic conditions that are likely to have affected vegetation and population structures among both humans and their primate relatives. Without taking into account the phylogenetic nature of the relationships connected to the various Homo sapiens divergences leading to recent humans, population geneticists have frequently interpreted this variation as supporting the out-of-Africa hypothesis in populations within Africa that have higher levels of molecular variation in both mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA than non-African populations. However, the African variation is the result of numerous Homo sapiens dispersals from Eurasia into Africa, and climate-related Eurasian Homo sapiens bottlenecks that reduce the non-African variation, the most distinct of which was that ending 125,000 years before present, according to the identity of these relationships, as maintained here and the paraphily of the African populations. Furthermore, the amount of Neanderthal DNA in African genomes is lower than that of non-Africans, a finding that is consistent with both the absence of Neanderthals and Denisovans from Africa, and an extended contact between Neanderthals and Denisovans with the non-African populations. A scenario of this kind agrees with climate history and the glaciation cycles discussed previously. The pygmies, like their neighbors, are dark-skinned and have tightly curled hair, but that hair is more thickly distributed over their body and face. They are also much smaller in size and have more pronounced foreheads, eyes, and teeth. At the same time, the pygmies were already living in groups widely scattered throughout the Central African rainforest. Although they were traditionally hunters and gatherers, they also traded with or worked for nearby black farmers. Yet, if you compare a given language as spoken by pygmies with a given language as spoken by black Africans, the pygmy version contains unique words and, sometimes, distinctive sounds. The pygmies are the only one of Africa's 5 races that lacks a distinct language. Each band of pygmies speaks the language of its nearby black farmers. All of the known Khorasan languages, which are renowned for being the only ones to use clicks as consonants, are restricted to southern Africa, with the exception of the click-heavy Hadza and Sandor languages, which are spoken in Tanzania, some 1,500 miles away from their closest linguistic relatives. Clicks or Khorasan words also appear in 2 Afro-Asiatic languages spoken by blacks in Kenya, who are even further away from the Khorasan peoples of today than are the Hadza and Sandor speakers of Tanzania. All this suggests that Khorasan languages and peoples previously extended far north into Africa, or until the Khorasan were exterminated by the black African farmers. Anthropologists infer from circumstantial evidence that pygmies were once numerous in the moist rainforest of Central Africa, but archaeologists find it challenging to test this hypothesis because they have not yet located ancient human skeletons. But all those other languages must have vanished, either because the peoples speaking them lost their original languages, as the Pygmies did, or because the peoples themselves disappeared. Given that Africa has 1,500 languages today, it was undoubtedly large enough to support more than 4 ancestral languages in the past. The scattered population suggests that pygmy hunters once roamed the equatorial forests, before being dispersed and isolated into small groups by the arrival of black farmers. Similarly, the Khorasan area of southern Africa is surprisingly small for a people so distinct in anatomy and language. Could the Khorasan be a remnant of a past population upheaval, which has clouded the genetics of modern human ancestry?